And check out this quilt behind me with the stars and the beautiful red and blue fabric. We need to have one, and this is perfect. It is absolutely gorgeous. Those white stars just stand out beautifully, and the red and blue fabrics. There's a mix of them. They look gorgeous together. And this is a quilt that you can make. This is a quilt kit that you can purchase, and all the fabric is included. And even better, it's pre-cut. That saves you half the time of making the quilt. So you can have this put together very quickly, and you're going to love it. It is so pretty. I'm going to show you step by step how we're going to make this. I'm Lea Louise from Inspired Quilting by Lea Louise, and I have the tips that you need to know in order to successfully complete this quilt and have a beautiful result. I think you're going to enjoy this, so let's get started. I want to show you how to make this quilt. This is the Star Spangled Quilt Kit, the newest quilt kit from the Fabric Hut, and I want to show you what's inside. This quilt kit is pre-cut, and that makes life so easy for quilters. We're going to get that quilt finished in probably half the time because we're not going to need to do any cutting. Now, here's an overview of what the quilt looks like. This gives us an idea of the fabrics that we need. All the instructions are inside, and assembly as well as cutting. If you want to use your own fabrics after making this quilt, all the information is in here. Now we will be paying attention to these instructions because this is how we'll be putting the block together. But let me show you these fabrics. Oh my goodness, these are such fun. And I like the mix of fabrics just from peeking in the package. And I love, look at that, all those blues, the reds, they're wonderful. And just a multitude of prints. And we have different sizes and strips. And the advantage with this being pre-cut is everything is precise. It's all laser cut. So you're getting exact size pieces. Now that also means you want to be consistent with your seam allowance so that everything fits well. If you're starting to have trouble, make sure you double check your seam allowance because that's always one of the areas we need to double check. So we have some blues here. We have some more reds in different sizes. And we're going to figure out here in just a few minutes how all these are going to go together. But look at how wonderful. This is pre-cut, ready to go, and we can start quilting right now. Before we start sewing, I want to show you a few things that we're going to prepare before we assemble our block. The flying geese are one of the blocks we're going to make initially, and I want to make sure that you get the right fabrics and understand what we're doing with this block. So here's our finished quilt block, and it looks absolutely wonderful. You can see the quilt behind me. Oh my goodness, isn't it beautiful? I love how these prints all work together. And what we're going to be doing next, and this is the first step in quilt assembly, is making our flying geese. And a flying geese block is a rectangle that is twice as wide as it is high. And that allows it to fit against the larger squares. And generally, when we use flying geese in a traditional quilt, we'll put two together like this point to point, and then that will equal a square. But what we're doing is we're going to use our flying geese to make our points of the star. And you can see there are 4 in each block, and then one right over here. And those together create our stars. Now, it's important that you grab the right fabrics because there are a number of different sizes, and I just want to show you how this will work. So we'll start with our 4.5-inch square, and you have them in both the blue and the red. And then we're going to use our 2.5-inch white squares, and you're going to need 4 of these for every large 4.5-inch square. The important thing that I want to show you is that these need to have a line drawn from corner to corner, and we want that line to get right up into the corner here and here. Now, I used a pen on this because I wanted you to be able to see it, but I actually use pencil when I'm making the quilt, especially on white fabric. Now, this line is going to be cut, so when we cut across here, we are not going to have to deal with that ink necessarily showing through, but I just don't like to use ink on fabric unless I absolutely have to for visibility. So let me show you what we're going to do with these particular squares and make our flying geese. It's a great technique to know. It's a wonderful block that you can use in so many different quilts. So take the time and learn how to make this. You're going to enjoy it. And now we're going to make our flying geese. And this is called the no waste flying geese method. Because of the way we put our blocks together, we have very minimal waste when making it this way, as opposed to the way it was done years ago. There was a substantial amount of fabric that we would lose. So we're using our 4.5-inch square, and then we have two 2.5-inch squares. And the first thing we're going to do is sew diagonally from one side to the other. Now you can see that there's a line drawn from corner to corner, and that's the line that we're going to be cutting on. So I want to make sure I sew 1/4 inch to each side. And when I get close, I'm going to stop and put my second block in place and tuck it underneath and make sure that my lines are in alignment, and continue on my seam to the other side. All right, then when we get here, we're going to turn around and come back the other direction. So I'm going to line this up again. I'm lining it against the cutting line because that's technically the edge of my fabric, but by doing it this way, we don't cut the corners, or excuse me, we don't cut the angles until we've done the sewing. The beauty of that is these bias seams are going to be held together really well in the fabric before it's cut. Sewing this after the fact, when you're sewing triangles to triangles, can be difficult because that fabric wants to stretch when you cut it on the bias or on the diagonal. So this works out really well. Now, you do want to watch this point right here. As you're sewing down this line, I don't want to use my finger and get too close to the needle. I'll use either my seam ripper or use a little stiletto, whatever you have handy, and just to hold it in place. And then once you're through, finish off. And we're just going to cut our threads. Now, the next thing we're going to do is the second half. And first we want to press this. If you'll notice, do you see how this doesn't lay perfectly flat? When we first started, the square was nice and flat, but we're sewing on the diagonal, and that tends to kind of shift the fabric a little bit. So at this point, you want to press this from the back side, and you only want to press from side to side in each direction. Don't get caught in trying to press along the seam, because that's your bias and it can stretch, and that will distort your fabric. And ultimately, your block may not come out as square as you'd like. So press this well. And I have one here already that I've pressed. And the next step is to cut this in half. And we're going to cut this right along the line that we drew. And now what we're going to do is press these open. We'll go this way. So we're going to open this up in this direction, here and here, and the same here. And again, we're going to press it. So we want that seam to come towards the small triangles. And I happen to have two right here that are nice and pressed. And what I'm going to do now is add the extra 2.5-inch square to each of these to make my flying geese. And I'm going to line the first corner right here with this outer edge, and line these corners up and this in the middle. Now what I want you to notice is, if you'll see that this little square from the smaller block that we're putting in fits right in the center here. Do you see that? And that little spot right here and right here is where your seam allowance is going to go. So it pretty well lays it out for you so you know just where to sew. You want to line yourself up and start your sewing right there in that corner and come all the way down to the edge. And when we reach the other side, we just spin around and come back up the other side. Just like that. And once this, let's get those threads cut, is sewn on both sides, we're going to turn it over and press it on the back just like we did the other one. And so we'll have it nice and flat, and then we cut this along the line. Just like that. And when we open this up, see how we get our nice flying geese. Now, the one thing you want to take a look at, and these are a couple points along the way that you can check. So when you first start sewing that extra block in, you watch that point up at the top, and that's your seam allowance. When you get to this point, you want to open this up and make sure that this is relatively straight. Now, sometimes these two pieces may not line up exactly aligned, and a little bit's okay, but you need to have a 1/4 inch from here to there. And what you can do is put your line of your ruler right on that point and make sure you, whoops, there we go, have that 1/4 inch seam right there. And that's going to be important for assembling your block. Now at this point we'd go through and we're going to press this, and we have our flying geese. And when I get the other pieces done, we're going to have a full set of 4 for each of these. So let me go ahead and get these pressed. I want to show you next how we're going to trim them, because these are a little bit oversized, which is wonderful because it gives you some flexibility and it allows you to trim off excess rather than coming up too short. Because if you make your block and it comes up small, it's not going to go together well. So this works out perfectly. All right, let me go ahead and get this ready and I'll show you the next step. An important step to this quilt is trimming the flying geese. We need them to measure 2 inches by 3.5, but they measure probably closer to 2.5 by almost 4 inches, and that's because we use oversized blocks to make them. That's a good thing because that gives you enough allowance to trim this down so you get it just the right size. If it were made with smaller pieces of fabric, there was too much of a chance that this block could come up short and wouldn't fit. So I'd rather have it come out a little bigger and trim it. It's going to work better. Now, the other thing I want to show you is I'm going to use a square ruler. And the important thing that we're going to utilize here is this 45-degree angle. And it goes from corner to corner in both directions. And notice it says 45 right there. Now our block is going to finish at 3.5 by 2 inches. So it's going to be that size. And if we put one in here right now, we can see that it is at about 3 3/4 by about 2 1/8. So it's not that much bigger. But what we want to do is make sure when we are trimming that we follow the 45-degree line. That angle is important for our flying geese to be centered and to have it flying straight. We don't want geese going every which direction. And I'm just going to do this on top of paper because I think it's going to be easier. So what we're going to do is we want to find the center of 3.5. And it's going to be at 1 3/4. So this center point right here, 1 3/4, you see that line, that's going to be the middle that will fall right here on that point. So when we put our ruler on top of our flying geese block, we want to make sure that this 1 1/4 right here lines up there. So let me go ahead and put that in place. There we are. And while we're doing that, we also want to make sure that our 45-degree angle is falling right in line with the flying geese block. So we have our flying geese 45-degree angle, and we have our 1/4 inch seam allowance, and it's lined up in the middle, right down the center at 1 3/4. So you just want to make sure that you're covered in those spots. Now I'm going to take the paper away, because what I want to show you is you also want to make sure you're allowing enough fabric all the way around to trim. So what I'm going to do now is cut this corner and there from that side around that one corner, and just like this. Now the other thing you want is, do you see that seam is exactly in the center, so that when we sew it, we're going to get a nice straight corner. And now we're going to take this and line it up at 3.5 by 2 inches. Now our 1 3/4 line marks right there at the point. Perfect. We have our 1/4 inch seam, so everything lines up great. And we're just going to trim off this other side like that, and then cut off that little dog ear. And now we have a perfect flying geese, and it measures 2 by 3.5 inches, exactly what we need. So we need to go through and do that with all our blocks so we can get this quilt block put together. We're getting so close. With the flying geese all complete and trimmed and ready to go, we're going to start putting our block together. And we begin with a 3.5 inch white square to create the star. And our flying geese go around all 4 sides. Now, 2 of the flying geese have matching 3.5 inch squares, and we're going to want to sew these together. And what you'll do is take the flying geese and line it up along one edge like this. And so when it comes forward, when it's sewn, you have your star points, and then this block continues here. I just want to show you, this is what it'll look like when it's finished. And when you do your seam, you'll use your 1/4 inch, and you're going to create a point on each side, and that's going to indicate where your 1/4 inch seam allowance is. So you're going to get beautiful points as you put your star together. So this is where we are with the first color, because there's 2 colors here, red and blue. And we have our red pieces in. Then we're going to start putting in the blue. And we have this one and this one. Now, there are actually 2 of these rectangles. And I made sure I put the star up on that side and put the check down here. I just didn't want the stars in the same place. I think it's sort of a better balance this way, but you decide what you like best. And then the 5 inch square goes in the corner. And then what we're going to do is sew our blocks in a row. So we'll do these three like this. And if you like, you can chain stitch. And what that means is you'll take one square, one block, in this case it's your flying geese, and line it up here. You're going to sew down. You're going to put this right on top there. And you know, I do recommend doing it this way with the white on top, because the shadow of the red fabric shows through nicely, and you can go ahead and sew right along that edge and know right where your point is. And then this one you'll sew, and again you have your point right there, so you'll come all the way through and sew these together. And then once that's done, you're going to add this last 3rd row, and you have a finished block. And I want to show you what that looks like. Here it is. Isn't that beautiful? Oh my goodness. It looks fantastic. And you're going to make these And you're going to also make the opposite where we have the blue and the red switching places. So then you can alternate your blocks as you assemble your quilt, and it really gives it a wonderful look. Well, we have our blocks pieced together. We have them chain stitched. Now it's time just to cross the seam from side to side and sew those and get them pressed. Let me show you where the pressing is done so far. So you can see we want the middle seams to come into the center, and then these outer seams will go towards the outer edges. And this is going to allow us to nest our seams. So let me go ahead and show you first. We're going to line these up. Now, I'm going to sew from this side because I want to be able to make sure I'm inside my corners here, but at the same time, I'm also able to see my point right here. The shadow from the fabric will show through, and that allows me to see everything while I'm sewing. So I'm just going to line up my seams, and what I'm doing, just get this thread out of the way, is putting these together seam to seam, and you see how the seam allowance goes in opposite directions. So if I open this, actually let me just trim this because I have my chain stitching. I'm just going to cut that so I can open this to show you that we want the seam to nest right next to each other. And you can see how they just abut right there for fold to fold. And so I'm going to want to hold that. Now, if it's easier for you, go ahead and put a pin in. And I put the pins from the point I'm going to be sewing from. So it's going to hold this seam allowance right where I want it to be. So as I'm sewing, then I can pull the pin out easily and everything lines up really well. Okay, so I'm going to begin and using my 1/4 inch seam allowance, make sure everything's right where it needs to be. And as I approach my seam, I want to pull the pin out, look for. And then once I get over that seam, I'm going to come down and I'm going to line this one up as well. And I can put my finger right there and I can feel it. And I'm going to just hold that with my hand. I can use my thumb and finger and hold that while I'm sewing. And you see how the light allows me to see where my point is, so I know right where to sew. Everything is pressed nicely, so I don't have to worry about that seam flipping over by the point. And I just want to come all the way down to the end, so I'll bring these two corners together and I will sew. And right here, remember, I have a point right there. I want to make sure that I stay on the outside of the point. And you can see how nice that point lines up right there and right here. And we want these to line up well. And oh, and look at that one. Oh, that came out so good. I love when they turn out great. And it's about taking your time. The patience to originally cut it, which you didn't have to do, but to sew them and trim them so they're the right size. And then as you're putting things together, make sure they're pressed first so they lay flat, and then everything's going to fit really well. So let me finish up some blocks here. And oh, I do want to show you the pressing. Let's take a look at that real quick. That's the seam that I just sewed right here. And what we want to do is press it open. So we're going to line our seams up, and we want to make sure that those seams nest. We're going to sew it exactly the same way, but we're pressing them open. And so press that really well, and this one too. And you want to make sure everything lies flat, because then when you go to quilt it, everything's right where it needs to be and it goes together beautifully. So let me show you how we put 2 blocks together. Once your blocks are finished and pressed, we're going to begin with the sashing. And you want to make sure you take the shorter 9.5-inch piece and not the long ones. First, we're going to add the short pieces between all of our blocks, and we're going to do it across the row. And then when the rows are finished, we'll join the long pieces of sashing here. Now, you'll notice this is all nice and straight, so I don't have to worry about points on the edge of this particular block. And so I'm just going to put this in and take my 1/4-inch seam, sew it nice and straight. And when I get to this point, I want to line up my bottom edge, and I'll just hold it here, and that way I know that my fabric is feeding evenly, and I'm not going to stretch anything out. And when I get to my seam allowance, I want to make sure it's lying in the right direction. And then here's the seam at the bottom and my corner. Line everything up and sew through. All right, now when you're laying your blocks out, just follow the diagram. The illustration will show you exactly how to place your blocks if you want to follow the pattern exactly. You can certainly do your own layout and do it that way, but I like the way that the stars are kind of twisted around. They're turned around here and there, and I think that looks really pretty. It just adds such interest to the quilt. I like that design. All right, so I'm going to begin here. Now, this has 2 points that I need to be cautious of. So I'm going to double check, line up my fabric here, and get my bottom points so they're lined up. Now, I'm going to look at this point right there. Do you see that? See how when this is open, I can see my point, and that's going to help me to sew in the right place. Now, there's nothing on the back that I need to match up, so we're just lining up the point. And where that point is there, I want to be on this side of it. Not much, just a little bit. And I'll get ready to come back this way and get this one in. Sometimes when you do triangles, this fabric wants to bow out on you. And if it does that, just kind of tuck it back in. We want this to be straight. If we let it bow out, then this is going to pull because we're eliminating too much fabric in the seam. All right, and let's get this lined up here. Good thing I checked. I was off a bit. Okay, and we're going to sew right on top of that. So I'm just going to hold this in place right there. And you can see there's my point and my needle right there. My needle is just to the side of that point. And now I can finish the rest of the way. Got all those threads. You don't want those threads lingering behind because when you go to do your quilting, you don't want any threads coming through that you can see. So now we have this wonderful, nice lattice strip. And let's add one more while we're here. So you're just going to do this for your rows from one side to the other. And this quilt does come in 3 sizes, or actually 4 sizes. I'm making the throw, but there is also the twin, the queen, and the king. So you can make this as big as you want. And that's pretty awesome. Once you get the hang of these blocks, you just, production line through and work your way. Get all of one step done, then come back and do the next. And talk about becoming proficient. You will definitely be a pro at. I'm going to line up my end and come down. I always just kind of pop this up to double check that my seam allowance is correct. If you prefer pins, that absolutely works. It's often about personal choices. Whoa, I keep losing that there. And what works best for you. So there we are. We have our blocks, we have our lattice strips, then we'll just put the strips in between and the quilt is going to be finished. Let me show you on the finished quilt how this fits into that quilt. And I want to show you how these finished blocks lay right in. So you can see we put that here and our strips or lattice will line up between the blocks, and then once we get the entire row finished, we keep adding until we get the number of blocks needed, and then we put a strip down here. So you have short strips and long strips in the kit, so make sure you grab the right ones. And that's it. Your quilt is finished. And then the best part, you get to quilt it and use this beautiful backing and gorgeous binding. What a fantastic quilt. Oh, this is a good one. I don't think you can pass it up. I hope you enjoyed watching this video as much as I did making the quilt. This is really a fun project, and look at how well it goes together. It's a beautiful finish, and I hope you're excited to make your own. You can get this pattern, including all the pre-cut fabric, in just a matter of days. So go ahead and get your pattern, get your fabric, get everything you need to make this gorgeous quilt, and you can get started right away. Thank you so much for being here. It has been such fun to share this with you, and as always, it is a pleasure to have you here. Have a fantastic holiday and be safe.